My mom's surprise divorce planned for my dad feels cruel. My parents have been married for almost 30 years. Their marriage is not great. My dad's the kind of person who will come home from work and get angry that there isn't dinner on the table. Growing up, my dad never treated my mother like an equal. She was expected to do all the housework and look after the children, and dote on her husband at all times. My parents have been empty nesting for a few years now. I have one younger sister, and we are both out of the house and have our own lives. Neither of us kids have particularly liked our dad. Like, we love him in the way that you love family, and we are grateful that he provided for us and helped us pay for college. But my dad is an asshole who treats my mom poorly, and I never respected him for this. I recently got brunch with my mother, and she dropped some pretty heavy news. She's planning on divorcing my father. I was honestly relieved and happy for her that she's finally doing this, but her plan to do so is rather troubling. My parents are Chinese immigrants. My dad's best friend growing up, Daniel, and his family have been saving up for a trip to the US for years. They will be visiting my parents over Christmas. My dad, naturally, put the burden of this whole trip on my mother. He told her to organize their whole vacation, planning meals, reservations, activities, etc. Basically, my mom is expected to be the complete tour guide and handle all the stress and organization of their visit, including picking them up from the airport, while my dad just gets to hang out with his childhood friend and not deal with anything. My mom doesn't even know these people. Apparently, however, this was the last straw for my mom. She is retaliating. She has only been pretending to organize this trip and faked a bunch of reservations and stuff to appease my dad. My dad thinks everything is organized and Daniel's family is being completely taken care of. Her plan, instead, is to serve him with divorce papers the day she is supposed to pick up Daniel's family from the airport. My dad will be out of town on business up until the day Daniel arrives, so she will be moved out by then. Daniel's family will be stranded at the airport, and my dad will come home to an empty house and no family. While I support the divorce, I can't help but feel like this plan is a little too cruel. She can be as vindictive towards my father as she wants, but to drag another family into this seems unfair. My dad completely deserves this, but Daniel didn't do anything, and his family doesn't deserve to fly into the US and face this level of commotion. Is it my place to say anything? I voiced to my mother my concerns, and she basically was like, "Fuck it and fuck him." I barely talk to my father, but I don't know who I should reach out to or who I can talk some sense into. My dad has never been violent towards my mom or anything, but I'm also nervous about what would happen if I told my father the truth before my mom has had a chance to gather herself and move out of the house without him being present. It just seems like an explosive argument waiting to happen. Update 1. Around the time Daniel's family was to be picked up, I get a phone call from my father. I decided, especially since this was the middle of a workday, to ignore it, because I frankly did not want to get wrapped up in the commotion. He called again and then sent me a series of texts, demanding to know the whereabouts of my mother. Now, if you recall, my father had been on a business trip this entire week. His first chain of messages, calls, was when had a layover in Denver. He was to be in Denver for 3 hours before he could get on his connection home. This means that, at this point, my dad is aware that Daniel's family has not been picked up because Daniel obviously called my father, and that my mother was not answering her phone, but he did not know why. He also called my younger sister, who said she genuinely had no idea what was going on, but also lived out of state so was unable to help. I later find out that my sister was also briefed by my mother about what might happen, so that she wouldn't get caught off guard, and she was just playing a fool to help my mother along. I eventually text my dad back, saying I have no idea what is going on, but I'm very busy at work and won't be able to get back to him for a while. My dad, unable to find immediate answers, told Daniel there must have been some miscommunication. He told them to get a cab from the airport to the house and just make themselves at home until my father could get to them. He gave Daniel the key code to the house, told him to call back once Daniel and his family were safely at home. Here's where things get a bit theatrical. My mother apparently attached the divorce papers to an easel with a nice big divorce label and note, and placed the easel right at the entrance hall to the house, so it's the first thing you see once you open the door. So, as you guess it, who gets the divorce news first? Daniel and his family. Daniel then has to tell my father that my mother is divorcing him. This is precisely what happens. Daniel recounts this in private to me later, which is how I know. But apparently, my father went through a range of emotions, from disbelief to a fumbling stutter to anger, you name it. This, by the way, is happening while he is at the Denver airport, surrounded by his colleagues. He then has to, presumably, give some sort of explanation to his work friends and deal with an awkward and uncomfortable plane ride back home. Long story short, my dad was incredibly embarrassed and flustered. He had no idea what to do or how to help himself or anyone. Daniel actually ended up coming to the rescue because he is apparently quite the meticulous planner and had many suggestions for activities and sightseeing. Basically, Daniel took charge of his own vacation while my dad fumbled around like a lost puppy, just tagging along their trip while being completely discombobulated. I expected my dad to put on a farce for Daniel and his family and pretend things were fine, but he was unable to do that at all. I think he legitimately and honestly believed that my mom would never leave him and was too much at a loss for words to even be angry. Later on, I stepped in to help out Daniel's family and make sure they were doing okay, giving my dad some time to himself. Overall, while they weren't wined and dined in quite the way the probably expected, Daniel seemed like a good and understanding friend, and they managed to have a productive vacation. Daniel said towards the end, when the shock had worn off, my dad and he were able to have a little fun. It was probably a good thing that Daniel was around to help my dad through it. As for my parents, in general, they are only communicating through their lawyers. My mom moved out to her own apartment. She hasn't told my father where she lives, and I am completely staying out of it. My mom seems like a brand new person to me. I am incredibly happy for her for being so brave and finally taking charge of her own life. My dad is pathetic and completely helpless. He's been wrapping himself up in his work and eating lots of takeout. I've been careful with my involvement. I will be supportive enough so he doesn't feel completely alone, but I am adamant to not become some sort of caregiver for him. I refuse to answer questions about my mother's whereabouts, but I do express sympathy for her. It's important for me to make sure my father recognizes that, honestly, I am on my mother's side, and that I never agreed with the way he treated her. That being said, I am also careful not to antagonize my parents towards each other. I want this breakup to be as clean as possible.